A rich man marries a candy seller to win a bet. What he discovers on their wedding night is shocking. Before the story begins, comment below and tell us which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Nicholas Miller never knew what it meant to lose. Since childhood, he had learned that everything had a price and that the world was like a giant chessboard where only the strongest made the rules. Money, power, influence were his greatest weapons. He used them without hesitation to get whatever he wanted. However, his personal life was nothing but superficial. Surrounded by people who flattered him, he had never experienced a real relationships. Beautiful, sophisticated women were always available to him. In the end, they were all replaceable. Love was just a concept invented for the weak. Love, that night. A luxurious party brought together the country's elite at the most exclusive club in the city. As always, Nicholas was the center of attention. His longtime friend Victor approached him with a teasing smile. With all that money, Nicholas, you really think you can have anything, don't you? Nicholas chuckled. Bored. I don't think I know everything. Everyone has a price. Victor laughed, swirling his whiskey glass. Then prove it. I bet you $3 million that you can't marry a woman completely outside of your world and stay with her for 6 months. Nicholas let out a cynical laugh. What kind of nonsense is this? Victor leaned in. That I'm talking about the candy seller at the traffic light in front of your company. She has no money, no beauty. I bet you won't be able to win her over. Marry her. Marry a woman from a completely different social class and live with her for 6 months. Nicholas laughed, sounding cynical. What kind of nonsense is this? Victor leaned in. I'm talking about the candy seller at the traffic light in front of your company. She has no money or beauty. I bet you won't be able to win her over. Marry her and make her fall in love with you. Nicholas laughed again, this time mockingly. You've got to be joking. Me, a millionaire who can have any woman I want, should marry a candy seller? Victor shrugged. What's the matter? Are you scared? Nicholas narrowed his eyes. Of course not. Then prove it. Get that girl to marry you. Make her like you. After 6 months. Leave her. Nicholas shook his head. Unconvinced that you've lost your mind. Or maybe you've lost your edge. Nicholas felt his blood boil that he never turned down a challenge. Victor knew exactly how to push his buttons. That he took a sip of whiskey and then extended his hand. Deal, Victor. Grand. Shook his hand. This is going to be fun. Nicholas agreed. Without realizing Victor had a hidden agenda. The next day, Nicholas ordered his driver to stop at the traffic light near his company. And that's when he saw Alice. She wore simple clothes, holding a basket of candy, walking between cars without hesitation. Even with indifferent stares around her, she kept a smile on her face. She never gave up. That intrigued him. Then Alice noticed someone watching her. She was used to curious looks. This one felt different. She walked toward the car, hesitant. Would you like to buy some candy? The man smiled. Actually, I'd like to talk to you. Alice narrowed her eyes. This had to be a prank. If you want to help, buy some candy, otherwise I need to keep working. The man kept smiling. My name is Nicholas Miller. I have a proposal for you. Alice felt her heart race. Who is this man? Proposal? What kind of proposal? Nicholas leaned slightly forward. I want you to marry me. Alice blinked. What? That's right. I want to marry you. She laughed in disbelief. You must be joking. I'm serious. Nicholas laughed again. Exactly. That's why I want someone I can. What are you talking about? Me. A millionaire who can have any woman I want. Marry a candy seller. What's the matter? Are you scared? Nicholas narrowed his eyes. Of course not. Then prove it. Get that girl to marry you. Make her like you. Stunned. That's right. I want to marry you. You must be joking. I'm serious. Alice took a step back. This had to be a scam. Look. I don't do that kind of thing. I'm not asking for anything inappropriate. Just a marriage. Alice crossed her arms. That doesn't make any sense. Why me? Nicholas observed her. You're joking. Right? Nicholas said. Laughing. I'm a millionaire. I can have any woman I want. I could marry a candy seller. Victor looked at Nicholas. What's wrong? Are you scared? Nicholas narrowed his eyes. Of course not. Then prove it. Make that girl marry you. Make her like you. A moment. Alice didn't answer. She felt a shiver down her spine. What do you mean by someone like me? Someone simple. Someone not connected to my world. She let out a short laugh. This is ridiculous. You have money. You could have any woman. Nicholas shrugged. Exactly. That's why I want someone I can. What do you get out of this? A marriage of convenience. Nicholas laughed again. This time mockingly. You've got to be joking. I'm a millionaire. I can have any woman I want. I can marry a candy seller. What's the matter? Are you scared? Nicholas narrowed his eyes. Of course not. Then prove it. Get that girl to marry you. Make her like you. Shape. Alice narrowed her eyes. So. You want to buy a wife. You could see it that way. Think about it. Your sister needs help. How much longer do you think you can keep up this exhausting routine before your body gives out? His words hit Alice like a punch. She worked day and night to pay for her sick sister's medical expenses. And medications. Her sister depended on her completely. She had always kept going. Never questioning it. What if one day she couldn't anymore? Nicholas noticed her hesitation. You would have a home. Security. Stability. Treatment for your sister. Alice bit her lip. What do you get out of this? A marriage on paper. That's all. Her stomach turned. And what if I say no? Nicholas smirked at us. Oh, your life stays the same. Your sister might have to pay the price for it. Alice's hands trembled. She was proud. Above pride. She had a strong sense of responsibility. Julia needed her. If marrying a stranger was the price to secure her sister's future. Then maybe. Nicholas laughed again. This time in mockery. You've got to be joking. I'm a millionaire. I can have any woman I want to marry. I could marry a candy seller. What's wrong? Are you scared? Nicholas narrowed his eyes. Of course not. Then prove it. Make that girl marry you. Make her like you. She looked into Nicholas's eyes, searching for any trace of hidden malice. All she saw was certainty. Taking a deep breath, she said, "All right. I accept." "Great," Nicholas said with a victorious smile. "I'll start the wedding preparations tomorrow." A few days later. The wedding happened so quickly. Alice barely had time to understand what was happening. From the moment she agreed to the proposal until the moment she signed the papers. Everything happened very quickly. It was as though she were just a pawn in Nicholas Miller's game. He handled everything, the paperwork, the clothes, the ceremony. He did not let her have a say in any of it. There were no flowers or emotional music. There was only a contract sealed with rings. The ceremony was held in an exclusive, luxurious, impersonal place. It felt more like a corporate event space than a wedding venue. Only a few people were there, including some of Nicholas's friends and a few important investors. They looked at Alice in a judgmental way the whole time. She had never felt so out of place. Nicholas, on the other hand, seemed completely relaxed. "It's almost over," he whispered to Alice when the person in charge called them to sign the papers. She nodded, feeling nervous. Her heart raced as she signed her name. Her simple handwriting looked out of place next to Nicholas's perfect signature, which was written with the precision of someone used to signing many documents that it's worth millions-dollar contracts. When the officiant declared them officially married, polite applause filled the room. Alice didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate. After the ceremony, dinner was served at a long, imposing table surrounded by guests who barely acknowledged Alice. She tried to ignore the whispers. "Is this for real?" "He married her," a blonde woman whispered to someone beside her. "Looks like a joke." A man in an expensive suit replied. "What does he see in her?" Alice pretended not to hear. Each word felt like a blow. Nicholas didn't seem bothered by anything. He was doing exactly what he had planned. He walked around the wedding with a confident smile, like it was just another business deal. Victor, the guy who suggested the bet, raised his glass to celebrate this unexpected marriage. His tone was sarcastic. Nicholas just smiled, raised his glass, drank. He wasn't bothered by Victor's hidden intentions. He was in control. Alice wasn't. Every glance and whispered comment made her skin burn with shame. She wanted to run. There was nowhere to go. When the party ended, Nicholas took her to his mansion. It was big, scary, cold. Just like him. Alice stepped inside, feeling small among the long hallways and shiny marble floors. "This is your new home," Nicholas said casually, handing her a cup of tea. Alice took the tea with shaking fingers. "Where will I sleep?" Nicholas smirked. "In the room next to mine. Don't worry. This is just a marriage of paper. I don't expect anything more than that." Alice nodded, feeling relieved but still cautious. Just as she was about to climb the stairs, Nicholas spoke. "I hope you understand your role here. You're my wife now. Your life has changed." Alice took a deep breath and turned around. "What exactly do you expect from me?" Nicholas's gaze was cold. "Just know how to behave." She didn't reply. She just climbed the stairs, feeling an immense weight on her shoulders. This marriage was nothing more than an agreement. Somehow, it was already costing more than she had imagined. The door to Alice's room closed behind her. Silence filled the space. She looked around the luxurious room, feeling completely out of place. The room was larger than the entire house she had shared with Julia. The beige linen curtains were so delicate. They seemed untidy. It was touchable. The bed was big enough for 3 people. But none of it felt welcoming. She was there because of a contract. Of a bet she hadn't even known about. sitting on the edge of the bed. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Outside, Nicholas was on the phone, probably talking about a business issue. He didn't seem worried about her being in the house, which made her feel a little better. Up to now, he had treated her like an object. Like their marriage was just another investment he had to deal with. But what bothered Alice the most was something else. She felt ashamed. She felt ashamed of the looks she got at dinner. Ashamed of the whispers. Most of all, ashamed of having accepted that situation. But she had done it for Julia. She would do it again if she had to. Nicholas suddenly came into the room without knocking. "I hope you've settled in," he said. His voice was neutral. Alice looked up, crossing her arms. "Do you always enter rooms without knocking?" he asked, raising an eyebrow and smiling slightly. "It's my house," Alice said, taking a deep breath and holding back her irritation. "But this is my room," Nicholas said, tilting his head slightly as if considering her response. "Fair enough," he said. Silence stretched between them until Nicholas took a few steps toward her. He said. "You don't seem very excited about marrying a millionaire," he said teasingly. Alice laughed dryly. "Should I be? Most women would be." She looked him in the eyes. "Most women have never been hungry." Nicholas frowned. "What do you mean?" "That not everything can be solved with money. So far, it seems to have solved a lot." Alice laughed dryly. "You think you bought me?" "I bought a marriage." "Not you." "Not you," she repeated. "If you think you have me under control, you're wrong." Nicholas arched an eyebrow. "I knew you were stubborn. I just didn't realize how much." Alice looked away. "Life taught me to be this way." "How so?" Alice hesitated. She had never shared her story with anyone. But for some reason, she felt it was time to tell Nicholas everything. She took a deep breath and looked up. "I sell candy at traffic lights all day." Nicholas nodded in agreement. "That I know that." Alice licked her lips. Her throat dry. "But that's not all." Nicholas observed her expression and noticed her hesitation. "Go on." Alice lowered her head, clasping her hands in her lap night. "I work in a bar." Nicholas frowned. "What kind of bar?" Alice closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "A men's entertainment bar." Nicholas nodded. "I know that." Alice licked her lips, her throat dry. "But that's not all," Nicholas observed. "Nicholas. What do you mean?" Alice lowered her head, her hands clasped in her lap. "What I mean is that at night, I work in a bar." Nicholas frowned. "What kind of bar?" Alice closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "A men's entertainment bar." Nicholas's face changed instantly. His expression hardened. "You work in a men's bar?" Alice felt a knot in her stomach. "Yes." Nicholas took a step forward, incredulous. "What exactly do you do there?" She looked up, holding her breath for a second before saying, "I'm a waitress. I serve drinks to men who look at me like I'm an object." Nicholas stood still. Alice continued, her voice shaking. "That I've been pushed, that I've had drinks thrown at me, that I've heard disgusting things." She swallowed hard. "Sometimes I have to run to the bathroom and cry, but I always clean my face. Go back to the floor. Keep smiling. That I do all of this because I need the money." Nicholas. He felt a tightness in his chest. She looked at him. Nicholas could see the weight of reality in her eyes. "Then why sister needs medication, she needs to eat." "That I do all of this for her." Nicholas felt something inside him break. Alice wasn't just a young woman with no resources, she was someone who fought every day to survive. The silence in the room became unbearable. Nicholas closed the distance between them and asked, "And what happened to your parents?" Alice closed her eyes for a moment. As if the memory was still too painful. "They're gone. My father was a construction worker. He died falling from a building under construction, and my mother got sick. We didn't." Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. He looked at Alice. She seemed upset. "My sister needs medication. She needs to eat. I do all of this for her." Nicholas felt something inside him break. Alice wasn't just a young woman with no resources. She was someone who fought every day to survive. The silence. Nicholas watched her waste away day by day. She died in his arms. Alice gripped her hands together, trying to hold back the pain. Nicholas looked away for a moment. He didn't know what to say. He had known many women in his life, women who had everything and still wanted more. Alice. She had never had anything. Even so, she was still standing. It was at that moment that Nicholas felt something strange inside himself, genuine admiration. Then a bigger concern took over his mind: his name, his reputation, his legacy. Nicholas took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. Alice looked at him, waiting. He ran a hand over his face. Before speaking, "You can't work like that anymore." Alice frowned. "What?" Nicholas hardened his expression. "You're my wife now. My wife can't live like that." Alice narrowed her eyes. "Are you worried about me or about your reputation?" Nicholas crossed his arms. "Both." Alice let out a bitter laugh. "Of course. I knew there was something behind this silence." Nicholas sighed impatiently. "It doesn't matter the reason that you're not working in that bar anymore." Alice stared at him. "You want to stop me from working?" He took a step toward her. "I want to stop you from being humiliated. You yourself said what happens there. I don't want my wife in that kind of environment." Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. She looked at him. Nicholas could see the weight of reality in her eyes. "My sister needs medication. She needs to eat. I do all of this for her." Nicholas felt something inside him break. Alice wasn't just a young woman with no resources. She was someone who fought every day to survive. The silence felt her chest tighten. "What about my sister? How will I support her?" Nicholas looked her straight in the eyes. "I'll provide everything you both need." Alice shook her head, trying to process his words. "I don't want your charity." He let out a frustrated sigh. "This isn't charity. You're part of my life now, Alice. Taking care of. You and your sister were part of the deal. You don't have a choice." She looked away, feeling suffocated. Nicholas crossed his arms. "Tomorrow, I want you to go and bring your sister here. She'll live with you." Alice's heart raced. "Are you serious?" "Yes." She remained silent for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. Sensing her hesitation, Nicholas spoke again. More calm this time. "You've spent your whole life doing everything by yourself. I understand, but now, you don't have to." Alice felt a lump in her throat. She didn't want to trust him. At that moment, Nicholas Miller was offering her something she had never had: security. For the first time, Alice felt Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He could see the weight of reality in her eyes. "My sister needs medication. She needs to eat. I do all of this for her." Nicholas felt something inside him break. Alice wasn't just a young woman with no resources. She was someone who fought every day to survive. The silence. A glimmer of hope. Nicholas was restless after his conversation with Alice the night before. He couldn't shake off the discomfort growing inside him. His entire life, he had believed that money was the solution to any problem. He thought that it could shape people to fit his world. Alice was different. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He could see the weight of reality in her eyes. My sister needs medication. She needs to eat. I do all of this for her. Nicholas felt something inside him break. Alice wasn't just a young woman with no resources. She was someone who fought every day to survive. The silence wouldn't submit to it. Nicholas had met women who pretended to be disinterested. Playing hard to get. Just to stand out. Alice wasn't playing. She genuinely didn't care about his status. Possessions. Name. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Let's have a little fun. Type pizza in the comments if you've read this. Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He could see the weight of reality in her eyes. My sister needs medication. She needs to eat. I do all of this for her. Nicholas felt something inside him break. Alice wasn't just a young woman with no resources. She was someone who fought every day to survive. The silence. Far. Only those who get here will understand. Now. Back to the story. Nicholas found himself staring at the breakfast spread on the mansion's dining table. He usually ate alone. That morning, Alice was sitting across from him, having breakfast as if it were any other day. Aren't you going to eat? She asked without looking at him. Nicholas realized he hadn't eaten. He picked up a cup of coffee. Just to appear busy. I'm not hungry, Alice said. Shrugging and continuing to eat. I'm not trying to please you. As absurd as it seemed. Nicholas felt a new emotion, frustration. He was used to being in control. With Alice, he felt completely out of place. Nicholas realized he hadn't eaten. He picked up a cup of coffee. Just to appear busy. I'm not hungry, Alice said. Shrugging and continuing to eat. I'm not trying to please you. As absurd as it seemed. Nicholas felt a new emotion, frustration. He was used to being in control. With Alice, he felt completely out of place. Have you thought about what you're going to do now? He asked. Breaking the silence. Alice looked up at him. Wary. What do you mean? She asked. Now that you don't have to work like that anymore. She slowly put her utensils down. You say that like it's some kind of liberation. Alice said. Taking a deep breath. Isn't it? Work was how I survived. It was hard. But. Nicholas was confused. He didn't know how to respond. What do you mean? Alice asked. Her voice wary. Now that you don't have to work like that anymore. She slowly put down her utensils. You say that like it's some kind of liberation. Isn't it? Alice took a deep breath. Work was how I survived. It was hard. At least it was my choice. Now I'm your wife because of a contract. My life depends on you. I don't see that as freedom. Nicholas frowned. You don't have to think of it that way. It's the truth. Silence filled the room. Nicholas realized he had never seen things from that perspective before. To him, money was power. A solution to any problem. To Alice, it was a prison. That irritated him. You can do anything now. You don't have to worry about money or your sister. That's supposed to make me happy. Nicholas didn't know how to respond. Alice stood up from the table. I need to pick up Julia. He nodded. Watching her leave. Why did this bother Nicholas? Spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work. He reviewed contracts. Analyzed investments. Discussed strategies with his lawyers. But nothing seemed important. His mind kept drifting back to Alice. He kept replaying their conversation from the night before. Imagining her serving tables for repulsive people. Why did this bother him so much? Men who treated her like trash, thinking of her selling candies at traffic lights. Ignored and humiliated, and it irritated him more than it should. The truth was simple, he had never cared about anyone but himself. He had always believed that the people around him existed to serve him. Admire him. Be discarded when they were no longer useful. Nicholas was distracted by Alice, who was different and unsettling him. He spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work. He couldn't stop thinking about her. He reviewed contracts. Analyzed investments. Discussed strategies with his lawyers. Nothing seemed important. He kept replaying their conversation from the night before. Imagining her serving tables for repulsive. Alice was different. Mr. Miller. Nicholas blinked. Realizing his assistant was speaking to him. What? You didn't hear a word I said. Did you? He asked. Frowning. The assistant cleared his throat. The European investor wants a meeting tomorrow. He asked for a response today. Nicholas ran a hand over his face. Exhausted. Tell him I confirm. The assistant nodded and left. Nicholas closed his eyes for a moment. He needed to pull himself together. Alice shouldn't be occupying this much space in his mind. It was too late to avoid it. When he got home that evening, he found Alice in the guest room, organizing some clothes. In a drawer. The sighter was a girl of about 8 years old. Looking around in awe. Julia? Nicholas asked. The girl turned to him hesitantly. Hi. She answered softly. Nicholas had never been good with children. This girl was the reason Alice had made so many sacrifices. He looked at Alice. How is she? She still doesn't believe. Nicholas was so distracted by Alice that he didn't even notice his sister Julia was there. Julia lowered her head. It feels strange. We've never had a place like this. Nicholas crouched down to her level. Now you do. The girl stared at him for a moment. As if seeking permission. Before looking at Alice as if to say. Is this okay? Alice smiled at her sister. It's okay. Julia. Julia nodded. Still seemed unsure. Nicholas realized that Nicholas spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work. He reviewed contracts. Analyzed investments. Discussed strategies with his lawyers. Nothing seemed important. His mind kept drifting back to Alice. He kept replaying their conversation from the night before. Imagining her serving tables for repulsive. Winning Alice over had already been difficult. Gaining her sister's trust would be even harder. But for the first time in his life, he actually wanted to try. Later that night, Nicholas climbed the stairs slowly. But as he passed by Alice's room, he noticed the door slightly open. He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. Nicholas was so distracted by his feelings for Alice that he couldn't focus on work. He reviewed contracts. Analyzed investments. Discussed strategies with his lawyers. Nothing seemed important. His mind kept drifting back to Alice. He kept replaying their conversation from the night before, imagining her serving tables for repulsive. Inside the room, Alice was on the balcony, gazing up at the starry sky. The soft glow of the moon illuminated her face. And for a moment, Nicholas just stood there, watching her in silence. "Are you feeling better now that your sister is here?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Alice turned slowly. "Yes. Thank you for that." Nicholas felt a racing heart. He wasn't used to feeling things like this. He took a few steps forward. "Alice. Do you feel anything for me?" Alice frowned, surprised. Nicholas realized what he had just asked and ran a hand over his face. "Forget it. Pretend I didn't say anything." He turned to leave. Nicholas was so distracted by Alice that he couldn't focus on work. He reviewed contracts, analyzed investments, discussed strategies with his lawyers. Nothing seemed important. He couldn't stop thinking about Alice. He kept replaying their conversation from the night before, imagining her serving tables for repulsive. Before he could take the first step, Alice spoke. "Sometimes you're cold and harsh. Other times you're kind. And it confuses me. I don't know exactly how I feel about you." "Nicholas." Nicholas froze. He was silent for a few seconds, processing her words. Then, without thinking, he turned back and took another step forward. Nicholas was so distracted by Alice that he couldn't focus on work. He reviewed contracts, analyzed investments, discussed strategies with his lawyers. Nothing seemed important. He couldn't stop thinking about Alice. He kept replaying their conversation from the night before, imagining her serving tables for repulsive. Nicholas held Alice's gaze. And, in a sudden impulse, gently cupped her face and kissed her. Alice remained still for a second, surprised. Soon, she felt her heart beat quicken and responded to the kiss. It was intense. Different. There were no contracts. No obligations. Just a real moment between them. The next morning, Alice woke up. Nicholas spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work. He reviewed contracts, analyzed investments, discussed strategies with his lawyers. Nothing seemed important. He kept thinking about Alice. He kept replaying their conversation from the night before, imagining her serving tables for repulsive. Slowly, he felt the soft morning light coming through the window. The warmth beside her reminded him of the night before. For a moment, his heart raced. He turned slowly and saw Nicholas lying next to her, his eyes open, watching her. "Good morning," he said, his voice husky. Alice smiled shyly. "Good morning," Nicholas said, running a hand over his. He looked like he was still thinking about everything. Then he turned completely toward her. "I need to talk to you." Alice stopped breathing. "What is it?" Nicholas took her hand. "I don't want this to just be a contract." Alice frowned. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "I want a real life with you. I'm falling for you." Alice felt a lump in her throat. "Nicholas, I know this might seem unexpected. It's how I feel that I don't want our relationship to be just an agreement anymore, that I want it to be real." She looked away for a moment, trying to process his words. "That I feel the same way about you." Nicholas stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. Alice took a deep breath. "But I need you, Nicholas. I know this might seem sudden, I feel like I'm ready to move past our relationship being based on obligation. I want it to be authentic." She looked away for a moment, trying to process his words. "I feel the same way about you," Nicholas said, waiting for her to continue. "Nicholas, please stop being so cold to me. I need you." Nicholas gently held her face between his hands. "That's over. Everything will be different now." Alice smiled. Nicholas kissed her again. The days that followed were unlike anything Nicholas had ever experienced. His relationship with Alice deepened in ways he had never imagined. They were no longer distant from each other. Alice, who had once kept a barrier between them, had started to trust him. Nicholas noticed it in the little things. She no longer pulled away when he got close, looked away when he complimented her for the first time. She felt comfortable around him. That meant more to him than he. Nicholas wanted to make her happy in every way he could. He arranged special dinners, bought gifts for Julia, made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled, it felt like a small victory for him. But no matter how hard he tried, there was a weight he couldn't ignore. The bet. Alice didn't know the truth. She had no idea. Nicholas wanted to make her happy. He arranged special dinners, bought gifts for Julia, made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled, it felt like a small victory for him. But no matter how hard he tried, there was a weight he couldn't ignore. He tried to push the thought aside. Every time he looked at her, he felt guilty. He wanted to tell her. He was also afraid of losing everything. This fear grew stronger every day. Later, Nicholas wanted to make her happy. He arranged special dinners, bought gifts for Julia, made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled, it felt like a small victory for him. But no matter how hard he tried, there was a weight he couldn't ignore. The bet. Alice didn't know the truth. She had no idea. His office phone vibrated. Victor. His jaw tightened. He hadn't spoken to Victor since the wedding. He didn't miss it. Reluctantly, he answered, "What do you want?" "We need to talk. Now." Nicholas exhaled sharply. "I don't have time for this. You'll want to hear what I have to say." The call ended. That wasn't a good sign. Nicholas wanted to make her happy. He arranged special dinners, bought gifts for Julia, made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled, it felt like a small victory for him. But no matter how hard he tried, there was a weight he couldn't ignore. He had a bet with Victor. Alice didn't know the truth. She had no idea. He grabbed his car keys and drove to the bar where he usually met Victor. When he walked in, his friend was already sitting there, twirling a glass of whiskey between his fingers. "Thought you forgot about me?" Victor said without looking up. Nicholas sat down across from him, impatiently. "Get to the point. How's your wife?" Nicholas wanted to make her happy. He arranged special dinners, bought gifts for Julia, made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled, it felt like a small victory for him. But no matter how hard he tried, there was a weight he couldn't ignore. The bet. Alice didn't know the truth. She had no idea. Crossed his arms. "What do you want?" "Victor." Victor took a sip of whiskey before answering. "Do you really think I made that bet for no reason?" Nicholas frowned. "What do you mean?" Victor leaned forward. "I knew who Alice was even before I challenged you. Nicholas's stomach turned. I used to go to the bar where she worked. Nicholas remained silent. Nicholas wanted to make her happy. He arranged special dinners. Bought gifts for Julia. Made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled. It felt like a small victory for him. No matter how hard he tried. There was a weight he couldn't ignore. The bet. Alice didn't know the truth. She had no idea. Silent. Victor chuckled, "Ah. Now you're getting it. Aren't you?" Nicholas clenched his fists. "What are you trying to say?" Victor spun the glass between his fingers. Savoring the moment. "I always wanted Alice. I kept trying to take her out. She never gave me the time of day. He ignored me. Treated me like I was nothing." Nicholas felt as Nicholas wanted to make her happy. He arranged special dinners. Bought gifts for Julia. Made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled. It felt like a small victory for him. No matter how hard he tried. There was a weight he couldn't ignore. The bet, Alice didn't know the truth. She had no blood boil. You set all this up for revenge. Victor laughed again. Revenge. That's a strong word. I just wanted to see how far you'd go with the bet. Honestly. What I really wanted was to see Alice humiliated. Nicholas couldn't hold back. He stood up and grabbed Victor by the collar. Pulling him close. Victor remained unfazed. You played. Nicholas wanted to make her happy. He arranged special dinners. Bought gifts for Julia. Made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled. It felt like a small victory for him. But no matter how hard he tried. There was a weight he couldn't ignore. The bet, Alice didn't know the truth. She had no. The same game I did. Nicholas. The difference is I knew what I was doing from the start. You. On the other hand. Got lost along the way. Didn't you? Nicholas shoved him back. Disgusted. I trusted you. That was your mistake. Nicholas took a deep breath. Trying to control his rage. He needed to fix this. Without saying another word. He turned and Nicholas wanted to make her happy. He arranged special dinners. Bought gifts for Julia. Made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled. It felt like a small victory for him. No matter how hard he tried. There was a weight he couldn't ignore. Alice didn't know the truth. She had no idea. She left the bar. Leaving Victor behind. Nicholas drove home. Feeling uneasy. Alice trusted him now. Even though it had all started as a dirty game. What he felt for her now was real. What if? When she found out the truth. She never wanted to see him again. When he walked into the mansion. Alice was in the living room. Room with Julia helping her finish a puzzle. She smiled when she saw him. Hi. How was your day? Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. She had no idea what was coming. Tiring. He said. Trying to hide the storm in his mind, Alice looked at him closely. Are you okay? Nicholas opened his mouth to respond. No words came out. Julia called out. Excitedly before he could say anything. Nicholas. Come look. We finished the puzzle. Alice smiled. Go see it. I'll wait. Nicholas hesitated. Can we talk later? Alice nodded. He walked over to Julia. Trying to smile at the girl. His thoughts were elsewhere. The truth couldn't wait much longer. When Alice found out. Would he still have a Nicholas wanted to make her happy? He arranged special dinners. Bought gifts for Julia. Made a point of being present. Each time Alice smiled. It felt like a small victory for him. No matter how hard he tried. There was a weight he couldn't ignore. Alice didn't know the truth. She had no chance to fix the damage. Over the past few days, he had been more than just a husband by contract. He was present. Kind. Making an effort to make her and Julia truly feel part of his life. She trusted him. All of that was about to fall apart. Later. Alice sat in the garden. The housekeeper appeared at the door. Mrs. Miller, there's a man here who wants to speak with you. Alice frowned. Who is it? Before the housekeeper could answer, a voice dripping with sarcasm echoed across the garden. Alice, what a pleasure to see you. She turned and felt a chill of discomfort. Victor, he feeling the breeze on her face when the housekeeper appeared at the door. Mrs. Miller said. There's a man here who wants to speak with you. Alice frowned. Who is it? Before the housekeeper could answer, a voice dripping with sarcasm echoed across the garden. Alice. What a pleasure to see you. She turned and felt a chill of discomfort. Victor. He was leaning against the doorframe. The same smug smile that always irritated her. What do you want? She asked. Her voice automatically turning cold. Victor took a few slow steps toward her. I thought we should talk, Alice said. Crossing her arms. We have nothing to talk about. Oh. We do. Alice narrowed her eyes. Be direct. Victor let out a low. Leaning against the doorframe. She saw the same smug smile that always irritated her. What do you want? She asked. Her voice automatically turning cold. Victor took a few slow steps toward her. I thought we should talk, Alice said. Crossing her arms. Oh. We do. Be direct. Victor let out a low laugh. You really think this marriage is real? Don't you? Alice's stomach turned. What do you mean? Victor gave a cruel smile. Nicholas never wanted to marry you. It was all a game. A bet. Alice's blood ran cold. What? Victor savored the moment. Watching the impact of his words. That's how it all started, a bet between friends. I dared Nicholas to marry you to see if he could mold you to his world. Just for my amusement. Alice felt her head spin. That you're lying. Victor raised his hands. Feigning innocence. Oh. My dear. I wish I were, but ask him, ask how it all began, ask why he chose you. Alice took a step back. Her heart racing. That you're lying. She repeated. Her voice came out. Nicholas wanted to marry you to see if he could change you to fit in with his world. Just for fun. Alice felt dizzy. You're lying. Victor raised his hands. Acting innocent. Oh. My dear. I wish I were. But ask him. Ask how it all began. Ask why he chose you. Alice took a step back. Her heart racing. You're lying, she repeated. Her voice came out weak. Victor laughed. If you want to fool yourself, go ahead. I'm only telling you this because I thought you should know who you're sleeping next to. Alice felt her legs weaken. She spun on her heels and ran inside the house. Struggling to breathe. She needed to hear it from Nicholas himself. She needed to see him deny it. She needed to believe this was all a lie. Nicholas was in his office. Reviewing some documents. When the doors suddenly burst open, Alice stormed in like a hurricane. Her eyes were red. Her chest was heaving. Nicholas stood up immediately. Alarmed, Alice. "What's wrong?" She was trembling, her eyes burned with tears. "Tell me it's not true." Nicholas frowned. "What?" Nicholas laughed. "You can fool yourself if you want. I'm only telling you this because I thought you should know who you're sleeping next to." Alice felt her legs weaken. She spun on her heels and ran inside the house, struggling to breathe. She needed to hear it from Nicholas himself. She needed to see him deny it. She needed. Alice swallowed hard, her voice shaky. The bet. Silence filled the room. And in that moment, Alice knew the absence of an answer was all she needed to hear. The ground seemed to vanish beneath her feet. "Alice." Nicholas tried to step closer. She immediately stepped back. "Don't touch me. I can explain." "Explain what?" Alice shouted. Her voice filled. "You're just a game to you. Every word, every gesture, every touch was a lie." Nicholas ran his hands through his hair. "Desperate. At first. Yes. But then Alice. Everything changed." "I changed," Alice said, her voice bitter. "You made me believe I could trust you. That I could love you." She looked deep into his eyes. Nicholas laughed. "If you want to fool yourself, go ahead. I'm only telling you this because I thought you should know who you're sleeping next to." Alice felt her legs weaken. She spun on her heels and ran inside the house, struggling to breathe. She needed to hear it from Nicholas himself. She needed to see him deny it. She needed. Nicholas felt his chest tighten. "I fell in love with you, Nicholas. Now I find out I was just entertainment for you." Nicholas felt his heart shatter. "You were never just entertainment to me." Alice didn't want to hear it. She turned and ran out of the office. Nicholas shouted after her. She didn't look back. "Alice's. Are you crazy? You almost." Nicholas laughed, amused. "You want to fool yourself. Go ahead. I'm only telling you this because I thought you should know who you're sleeping next to." Alice felt her legs weaken. She spun on her heels and ran inside the house, struggling to breathe. She needed to hear it from Nicholas himself. She needed to see him deny it. She needed. Pain was unbearable. She ran aimlessly, not knowing where to go. Tears streamed down her face. Her chest burned. Her mind screamed. She needed to get away from there. Nicholas ran after her. "Alice. Please stop." She rushed through the gate, unaware of her surroundings. She didn't see the car speeding toward her. The sound of the horn tore out weak. Victor laughed. "If you want to fool yourself, go ahead. I'm only telling you this because I thought you should know who you're sleeping next to." Alice felt her legs weaken. She spun on her heels and ran inside the house, struggling to breathe. She needed to hear it from Nicholas himself. She needed to see him deny it. She needed. Through the air. The headlights blinded her. A scream caught in her throat. Then a strong pull yanked her back from the street. Her body hit the ground, wrapped in Nicholas's arms. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breathing erratic from the panic. Nicholas held her tightly, his expression wild with fear. "Are you crazy? You almost died." Alice blinked a few times, trying to process what had just happened. The car sped away. All she could hear was the sound of her own ragged breathing. Nicholas looked at me, she tried to pull away. Her legs were too weak, let me go. No, Alice pushed against him. He didn't budge. Why? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Nicholas laughed. You're so weak. If you want to fool yourself, go ahead. I'm only telling you this because I thought you should know who you're sleeping next to. Alice felt her legs weaken. She spun on her heels and ran inside the house, struggling to breathe. She needed to hear it from Nicholas himself. She needed to see him deny it. She needed. Trembling, Nicholas took a deep breath. Because I love you, he said. Alice's eyes widened. Then her body couldn't take it anymore. Her vision darkened. Her legs gave out. Nicholas caught her just before she collapsed to the ground. Alice, he said. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His voice filled with panic. He scooped her up in his arms and rushed toward. Stay with me. Love. Please. Nicholas felt his heart pound wildly in his chest. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after everything. Time felt frozen. Nicholas drove as fast as he could, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded. His breathing was uneven. Alice had passed out in his arms just minutes earlier. The car. Nicholas laughed. If you want to fool yourself, go ahead. I'm only telling you this because I thought you should know who you're sleeping next to. Alice felt her legs weaken. She spun on her heels and ran inside the house, struggling to breathe. She needed to hear it from Nicholas himself. She needed to see him deny it. She needed a go. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror every second, checking to see if she moved or made any sound. She didn't. Her face was pale. Her lips slightly parted. She looked so fragile that his fear grew stronger with every mile. Hold on. Alice, he murmured, feeling the fear claw his chest like a suffocating shadow. If anything. The weak Victor laughed. If you want to fool yourself, go ahead. I'm only telling you this because I thought you should know who you're sleeping next to. Alice felt her legs weaken. She spun on her heels and ran inside the house, struggling to breathe. She needed to hear it from Nicholas himself. She needed to see him deny it. She needed. What happened to her? He would never forgive himself. Never. Nicholas rushed into the hospital, carrying Alice in his arms, ignoring the shocked looks from the nurses. I need help, his voice came out more desperate than he intended. A medical team quickly approached, placing Alice onto a stretcher. What happened? One of the doctors asked. She passed out. She was very upset and almost got hit by a car. The doctor nodded and pushed the stretcher down the hallway. Nicholas tried to follow. A nurse stopped him. Sir, you need to wake up. He stood there, breathing heavily. Every second of waiting felt like torture. He ran his hands over his. She passed out. She was emotionally distressed and almost hit by a car. The doctor nodded, pushing the stretcher down the hallway. Nicholas tried to follow. A nurse stopped him. Sir, you need to wake up. He stood there, his chest rising and falling heavily. Every second of waiting felt like torture. He ran his hands over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. All he could see in his mind was Alice running, the car headlights illuminating her face and the panic in her eyes before she fainted. This was all his fault. He sank into one of the waiting room chairs, feeling helpless. The first time in his life. He was afraid of losing something that. Nicholas felt a mix of emotions. He was trying to organize his thoughts. All he could see in his mind was Alice running. He saw the car headlights illuminating her face and the panic in her eyes before she fainted. He felt guilty. He sank into one of the waiting room chairs, feeling helpless. The first time in his life. He was afraid of losing something that truly mattered. The minutes felt like hours. Finally the doctor returned. Nicholas stood up so quickly that he almost lost his balance. "How is she?" the doctor asked. "Alice is fine. She just had a strong emotional shock. She needs rest." Nicholas exhaled, relieved. But then the doctor continued. "There's something else." "What else is there to know?" Nicholas frowned. "What is it?" The doctor looked at the chart and then back at him. "Your wife is pregnant." Nicholas felt the world stop. "What?" "Alice is expecting a baby." He blinked several times as if he had misheard. "She's pregnant." "Yes." Nicholas ran a hand through his hair, his heart racing. Alice was expecting. Nicholas felt a sense of shock and disbelief. "What is it?" The doctor looked at the chart and then back at him. "Your wife is pregnant." Nicholas felt the world stop. "What?" "Alice is expecting a baby." He blinked several times as if he had misheard. "She's pregnant." "Yes." Nicholas ran a hand through his hair, his heart racing. Alice was expecting his child. The weight of the news was overwhelming. A whirlwind of emotions hit him all at once: fear, uncertainty. Above all, overwhelming joy. He was going to be a father. Before he could get lost in the flood of emotions, a brutal truth struck him. Alice hated him now. She would never want to stay with him after everything. Nicholas was overwhelmed by the news. He felt a mix of emotions, including fear, uncertainty, and, most importantly, overwhelming joy. He was going to be a father. Before he could process all of these feelings, a harsh truth hit him. Alice hated him now. She didn't want to stay with him after everything that had happened. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice now soft. The doctor nodded. "Yes." "She's still very shocked." Nicholas nodded and followed the doctor to the room. Alice was lying in the hospital bed, her eyes looking at the ceiling. When Nicholas walked in, she turned away. Her expression was cold. He walked slowly towards her. "Alice," he said. He didn't respond. Nicholas pulled a chair up next to the bed and sat down. "You already know, don't you?" Alice turned to face him. "That I'm pregnant." "Yes." Her voice was cold and cutting. Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. "That I didn't know, Alice." "Now that I do," she laughed bitterly. "Now that you know what you're going to step into the role." Nicholas was overwhelmed with emotions. He felt fear, uncertainty, overwhelming joy. He was going to be a father. But before he could feel these emotions, he felt another, more brutal truth. Alice hated him now. She would never want to stay with him after everything. Nicholas took a deep breath. "I want to make things right. I want to be with you." Alice shook her head. Her eyes were full of pain. "No. You just want to ease your guilt." "That's not true." "Of course it is." Alice raised her voice. "You don't want to lose the game." Nicholas felt as though he'd never been You really think this is still a game for me? Alice. I don't know what to believe anymore. Nicholas closed his eyes for a moment before saying, I love you. Nicholas. You don't love me. You don't even know what. What? What? Alice's eyes glistened with unshed tears. What? 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 Nicholas felt a mix of emotions, fear, uncertainty, overwhelming joy. He was going to be a father. Then he heard a harsh truth: Alice hated him. She didn't want to stay with him after everything. Love is, he said. Shocked. I'm going to raise this baby on my own. Alice said. Nicholas felt his heart shatter. You can't keep me away from our child. I can. Nicholas said. He ran his hands over his face. Alice. Please. I want to change. She took a deep breath. Then changed. Away from him, Nicholas felt the ground crumble beneath him. He wanted to insist. To beg. The determined look in Alice's eyes stopped him. He had broken something inside her. Something he might never be able to fix. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Nicholas felt overwhelmed by the news. He felt many emotions, including fear, uncertainty, overwhelming joy. He was going to be a father. Then he felt a brutal truth: Alice hated him now. She did not want to stay with him after everything. Nicholas turned his head and said, I'm not giving up on us. Alice turned her head and said, Good. Nicholas swallowed hard. He felt like crying. Without saying another word, he walked out of the room. The first time in his life, he felt completely empty. It was raining a little that morning when Alice left the hospital. Yulia held her hand tightly. Her eyes were full of worry. Nicholas insisted that they return to the mansion and that she accept his help. Alice refused. She didn't want anything more from him. She just wanted to start her life over. Far from lies, the small, humble house where Alice and Yulia had lived for years seemed even smaller after everything she had experienced at Nicholas's mansion, but it was the only place where she didn't feel deceived. She looked around. Taking a deep breath, she was back at square one. That will be okay. Julia. She murmured. Forcing a smile, her sister nodded. Though her eyes said otherwise, Alice knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew her pregnancy would demand even more from her, but he was going to be a father. He felt a lot of emotions. Like fear and uncertainty. And, most of all, he felt very happy. Then he heard a very sad truth: Alice hated him now. She did not want to be with him after everything that had happened. She thought that it would be better to fight alone than to accept help from a man who had broken her heart. 2 days later. Alice was returning from the market when she saw Nicholas's car parked in front of her house. Her heart was beating very fast. She told herself to stay calm. Nicholas stepped out of the car as soon as he saw her. He looked tired. Alice can. He felt many emotions. Including fear. Uncertainty. Overwhelming joy. He was going to be a father. Before he could deal with all these emotions, he learned a difficult truth: Alice hated him. She didn't want to stay with him after everything that had happened. We've talked enough. She tried to walk past him. Nicholas blocked her way. I know you're trying to push me away. I won't let you go through this alone. Alice stared at him. I don't need your pity. It's not pity. Then what is it? Guilt. Nicholas closed his eyes for a moment. I just want to help you. Alice crossed her arms. The only help I need is for you to leave me alone. There was silence between them. Alice said, Go away. Nicholas said. For a brief moment his eyes flickered with emotion. Seeing that she wouldn't change her mind, he took a deep breath and nodded. I'll come back tomorrow. She felt a lump form in her throat. You don't have to come back ever. Nicholas hesitated. Then, without another word, he got into his car and drove away. Alice watched the headlights of the car disappeared into the dark street. As soon as Nicholas was out of sight, the tears she had been holding back finally fell. He couldn't sleep since Alice left. He had been trying to convince her that he was willing to change and that he would stand by her side. She rejected him every time. And now, here he was, sitting in his car, watching a scene that made his blood boil. Alice was standing at the traffic light. Even pregnant and even fragile. She was still selling candy as if nothing had changed. The cold wind ruffled her hair. Her determined expression tore him apart inside. She should be resting. She should be taking care of their baby. Alice refused to accept his help. A wave of frustration and anger surged inside him. She couldn't keep doing this without thinking twice. He got out of the car. Alice turned when she heard Nicholas's firm steps approaching. Her heart skipped a beat. She kept her expression remained unchanging. What are you doing here? She asked. Trying to keep her voice calm, Nicholas stared at her. His gaze intense. Alice crossed her arms. That I'm working. Or did you think I'd just sit around and wait for you to fix my life? Nicholas felt his frustration grow. You're pregnant. How can you stand here? You're pregnant. How can you stand here all day exhausting yourself like this? Alice lifted her chin. It's what I've always done. And how long do you plan to keep pushing yourself like this until you collapse in the middle of the street? If that's what it takes. Yes, her response hit Nicholas like a punch. Alice. God sake. Stop this. No. Nicholas felt exasperated. He ran a hand through his hair. You just want to punish me. Don't you? You want to make me feel guilty. This has nothing to do with you. I need to work. No. You just want to prove that you don't need me. Alice went silent for a moment. Maybe I do. Nicholas closed his eyes, feeling his heart. Enough. Nicholas exclaimed, his voice laced with urgency. Alice. Please, stop this. She turned away. Her breathing labored and lips pale. Nicholas. Please, go home. He stood, staring at her. At her small, fragile body. At the way she instinctively held her belly. As if protecting their unborn child from its father. He turned, slowly making his way back to his car. Before he could get in, a sharp sound. Enough! Nicholas exclaimed, his voice ringing out as he rushed towards Alice. She had fallen to the ground. Her breathing labored and lips pale. Alice. Please wake up, he said. His voice filled with concern. Stop this, he exclaimed. His voice wild. I can't lose Alice or their child. Nicholas ran to the car and sped toward the hospital. At the hospital, he paced back and forth. His chest felt heavy. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Alice and the baby. Then the doctor appeared. He rushed forward. How is she? The doctor asked. Alice is stable. The baby is at risk, the doctor replied. Nicholas's world stopped. What? He asked. The physical strain she put on herself has put the pregnancy in danger. If she keeps pushing herself like this, she could lose the baby. Nicholas felt a lump in his throat. Their child, the thought. He said. Nicholas felt a sense of urgency as he thought about the innocent life growing inside Alice. He closed his eyes. Trying to contain the pain, what can I do? She needs complete rest and peace of mind, Nicholas nodded. Even as he felt desperate that he would do anything to protect them, Nicholas entered the hospital room. Stop this. Alice, he shouted. No, she said. Her voice cracking. Nicholas stepped closer. His chest tightening. Alice, he said. His voice breaking. I don't know if I can trust you again, she said. Her eyes filling with tears. I know, he said. His voice cracking with emotion. Nicholas gently took her hand. Hand in his. I won't let anything happen to you or to our child. Alice blinked a few times. Remained silent. Nicholas held her hand tightly and said. Let me take care of you. Alice closed her eyes. I don't know if I can trust you again. Nicholas felt his heart ache. I won't give up proving that you can. She sighed. But didn't pull her hand away. Nicholas felt like he was already starting to pull her in. Alice gazed out the hospital room window. Lost in thought. She had never wanted to depend on Nicholas. She never wanted to need him. Now, with the baby at risk, she couldn't act solely based on her wounded heart. She had to think about the child. You're exhausting yourself. You need to rest. I'm fine, Alice insisted. No. You're not. You need to see the doctor. Fine, Alice agreed. Nicholas entered the room. You're coming with me, he said. What? You and Julia will live at my house until the baby is born. Fine, Alice crossed her arms. Nicholas continued to insist, Alice. You can't keep exhausting yourself like this. It's not about us anymore. It's about our child. Alice closed her eyes for a moment. She hated to admit it. He was right. Finally. She sighed and murmured. I'll stay. Nicholas felt relief wash over him. Then Alice looked up and said firmly. With some conditions. The mansion looked different when Alice returned. She entered slowly. Holding Julia's hand. while Nicholas watched them. "I want to make one thing clear." Alice turned to him, her expression determined. Nicholas crossed his arms. "I'm listening. I didn't come back for you. I'm here for my child." Nicholas nodded slowly. "I understand. Second, don't treat me like your wife. This isn't a marriage." There was a look in his eyes that Alice couldn't understand. Understood. Alice took a deep breath before continuing. "Third, if at any point I feel this isn't working, I'm leaving." The silence between them was heavy. Finally, Nicholas spoke. "If those are your rules, I accept." Alice nodded, even as her heart tightened. She didn't want to get hurt again. She wouldn't trust him any time soon. In the days that followed, Nicholas surprised Alice in ways she never imagined. He was there for her. Made sure her meals were organized. Made sure Julia was comfortable. Even decorated a room to be the future nursery. Alice watched from a distance. The cold, arrogant man she had known didn't seem to be the same person who now made her tea on chilly nights. That wasn't enough to make her forget everything he had done. One night, as she sat down on the couch, Nicholas came in with a blanket and covered her with it without saying anything. She looked at him, surprised. He smiled a little and left the room. Alice looked at the blanket covering her legs and sighed. Maybe Nicholas really was changing. But could she trust him again? Nicholas had never thought that his life would change so much. Before, his life was all about going to fancy parties and million-dollar meetings, dollar deals. Everything was predictable, controlled, comfortable. But now his home was full of life. For the first time, he didn't want it any other way. Nicholas woke up earlier than usual. He went down to the kitchen. To the surprise of the staff, started preparing breakfast. "Do you need help, sir?" asked the housekeeper. "No. I'll do it myself," he replied. She was surprised but nodded. Nicholas was changing. He wanted Alice to notice. When she came down for breakfast and found the table set and Nicholas serving juice to Julia. The girl smiled at him and asked, "Did you do all this?" Nicholas shrugged. "I thought it would be a good way to start the day," he replied. Alice looked at him cautiously, as if trying to decipher his intentions. She said nothing. She sat down and started eating. Maybe the first time, she was willing to accept his small gestures. Nicholas never imagined he would become so attached to Julia. The little girl followed him around the house, chatted with him about random things, asked questions he never thought he'd answer. "Nicholas, do you know how to draw?" she asked one day while playing in the living room. He laughed. "I'm terrible at it. Can we try?" Before he knew it, he was sitting on the floor with her, holding a colored pencil. Alice passed by the room and saw the scene. She paused for a moment, watching Nicholas interact with her sister. He felt worried. He started noticing details he had ignored before. If Alice looked tired, he would bring her a pillow to support her back. If Julia seemed bored, he would find something fun to do with her. If Alice felt nauseous because of the pregnancy, he would research foods that might help. He did all of this without expecting recognition. He did it because he wanted to. Little by little, Alice started to notice something. One night, Alice went out on the balcony to get some fresh air. A few minutes later, Nicholas appeared next to her. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Alice hesitated. "I don't know what to think of you," she said. "What do you mean?" Nicholas asked. "You've changed." "You're different," she replied. Nicholas nodded. "I'm trying," he said. Alice sighed. "But I'm afraid it won't last," she said. Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. He gently took her hand. "This time it's real," he said. Alice didn't pull her hand away. For Nicholas, that was a sign. The past few days had been unlike anything Nicholas had ever experienced. Life with Alice and Julia no longer felt temporary. He had grown used to Julia's laughter echoing through the house. Alice's once suspicious glances becoming softer. The growing feeling that there was something worth fighting for. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. Nicholas was in his office, trying to focus on a financial report, when he heard a scream from upstairs. He stopped breathing for a second, then ran out, taking the stairs 2 at a time. When he burst into Alice's room, he found her bent over the bed, eyes shut tight, teeth clenched in pain. "Alice," he gasped. "I think it's happening." Nicholas felt a cold shiver down his spine. "The baby?" Alice nodded, gripping the mattress. Nicholas blinked, trying to. Nicholas processed what was happening. Okay. I'll take you to the hospital." He hurried to grab the bag Alice had packed days before and helped her down the stairs. His heart pounded. For the first time in a long time, he was truly terrified. Nicholas drove as fast as he could, holding Alice's hand the entire way. When they arrived at the hospital, a medical team immediately took her to the delivery room. Nicholas tried to follow. A nurse stopped him. "Sir, you need to wait here. I'm not leaving her alone." The doctor looked at Alice, who nodded weakly despite the pain. "He can stay," she said quietly. Nicholas felt a lump in his throat. The team let him in. There he was, holding Alice's hand as he watched her fight through the pain and realized just how strong she was. "I'm right here," he whispered. "You can do this." Alice squeezed his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It hurts so much." Nicholas swallowed hard. "I know. You are the strongest woman I have ever met." Alice didn't respond. She gripped his hand even tighter. Minutes felt like hours. Nicholas had never felt so helpless. Watching Alice struggle and hearing, "You can do this." Alice squeezed his hand tightly. Tears streamed down her face. "It hurts so much." Nicholas swallowed hard. "I know. You are the strongest woman I have ever met." Alice didn't respond. She gripped his hand even tighter. Minutes felt like hours. Nicholas had never felt so helpless. Watching Alice struggle, hearing the sound of the monitors filling the room. Then, suddenly, a fragile cry echoed through the air. Alice collapsed, exhausted, while Nicholas felt something inside him shift forever. The baby was born. The doctor took the tiny newborn and, after the initial checks, placed him in Alice's arms. Nicholas, the doctor gave instructions. The sound of the monitors filled the room. Suddenly, a fragile cry echoed through the air. Alice collapsed, exhausted, while Nicholas felt something inside him shift forever. The baby was born. The doctor took the tiny newborn and, after the initial checks, placed him in Alice's arms. Nicholas stood there, unable to move, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He stepped closer, his breath shaky. Alice was crying softly as she held the baby against her chest. "It's a boy," the doctor said, smiling. Nicholas stared at the tiny, delicate face. The little eyes still shut. The flushed skin. Then, something inside him changed. He understood. He stood there, unable to move, feeling a lump in his throat. He stepped closer, his breath shaky. Alice was crying softly as she held the baby against her chest. "It's a boy," the doctor said, smiling. Nicholas stared at the tiny, delicate face. The little eyes still shut. The flushed skin. Then, something inside him changed. He understood why Alice was so strong. He understood why she had fought so fiercely. He understood that nothing in the world mattered more than this moment. Alice lifted her gaze to him. Nicholas took a deep breath. His voice was unsteady. "Can I hold him?" Alice hesitated for a second, then carefully placed the baby in his arms. Nicholas understood why Alice was so strong. He understood why she had fought so fiercely. He understood that nothing in the world mattered more than this moment. Alice lifted her gaze to him. Nicholas took a deep breath. His voice was unsteady. "Can I hold him?" Alice hesitated for a second, then carefully placed the baby in his arms. Nicholas felt something indescribable. The tiny life in his arms was his son. He held the baby gently, feeling his eyes sting with tears. "Hey there, little guy," he said. The baby curled his tiny fingers. Nicholas felt his chest tighten. He never imagined something like this would affect him. Here he was, completely changed, completely surrendered. He looked at Alice, who was still holding their baby. The first time, she looked at him without anger or pain. Her eyes showed a different emotion than he had ever seen before, hope later. Nicholas sat by Alice's bed, holding their son's tiny hand. Alice, exhausted, watched him that I never thought I'd see. Nicholas understood why Alice was so strong. He understood why she had fought so fiercely. He understood that nothing in the world mattered more than this moment. Alice lifted her gaze to him. Nicholas took a deep breath. His voice was unsteady. "Can I hold him?" Alice hesitated for a second, then carefully placed the baby in his arms. "And Nicholas, you like this?" Nicholas smiled, still looking at the baby. "Neither did I." Alice took a deep breath. Nicholas looked at her. She hesitated. "I don't know what the future holds for us," she said. Nicholas nodded, understanding. But she continued. "I think you're becoming the man I wanted you to be." Nicholas's heart raced. He wasn't expecting immediate. Nicholas understood why Alice was so strong. He understood why she had fought so fiercely. He understood that nothing in the world mattered more than this moment. Alice lifted her gaze to him. Nicholas took a deep breath. His voice was unsteady. "Can I hold him?" Alice hesitated for a second, then carefully placed the baby in his arms. And Nicholas? He forgave her. But this was already a start. He held her hand and whispered, "I'll never stop trying." Alice closed her eyes. Nicholas knew that at last he had something truly worth fighting for. Nicholas had never felt so complete as he did now. The birth of his child had touched him in a way he never expected. That tiny little being in his arms had become the most important thing in the world to him. But even though he wanted to celebrate this new beginning, he knew there was still a barrier between him and Alice. She was more open, less hostile. She hadn't said she forgave him. And Nicholas was willing to do anything to prove he deserved a second chance that night. Nicholas understood why Alice was so strong. He understood why she had fought so fiercely. He understood that nothing in the world mattered more than this moment. Alice lifted her gaze to him. Nicholas took a deep breath. His voice was unsteady. "Can I hold him?" Alice hesitated for a second, then carefully placed the baby in his arms. Nicholas stayed at the hospital. Alice was sleeping deeply, exhausted from the delivery. The baby lay in the crib beside her. Nicholas sat in a chair, unable to take his eyes off his son. He had never imagined that something so small could hold such great meaning. When the baby began to stir and whimper, Nicholas got up quickly. It was his Nicholas had never cared for a newborn before. His heart was pounding as he picked up the baby, feeling clumsy. "Hey, little guy. It's okay. Daddy's here," he said, before realizing that he had said "Daddy." In that moment, Nicholas knew there was nothing in the world he wanted more than to be a dad. The baby calmed down in his arms. Nicholas stood there, gently rocking him. Nicholas understood why Alice was so strong. He understood why she had fought so fiercely. He understood that nothing in the world mattered more than this moment. Alice lifted her gaze to him. Nicholas took a deep breath. His voice was unsteady. "Can I hold him?" Alice hesitated for a second, then carefully placed the baby in his arms. And Nicholas. He had finally found something that truly mattered. 2 days later, Alice and the baby were discharged. Nicholas had organized everything to welcome them home. The nursery was ready, every detail planned for their comfort. Alice looked around, surprised by his dedication. "Did you do all this by yourself?" Nicholas nodded. "I wanted." Nicholas knew why Alice was so strong. He knew why she had fought so fiercely. He knew that nothing in the world mattered more than this moment. Alice lifted her gaze to him. Nicholas took a deep breath. His voice was unsteady. "Can I hold him?" Alice hesitated for a second, then carefully placed the baby in his arms. "Everything to be perfect for you." She didn't respond. He noticed a different sparkle in her eyes. It was a small step. Nicholas knew he had many more to take before winning back her love. The first few days were chaotic. The baby cried in the middle of the night. Alice was exhausted. Nicholas tried to help as best he could. Nicholas was determined to be involved in everything, even though he didn't have experience. "You can get some sleep," he told Alice one night, taking the baby in his arms. "Are you sure?" Alice asked. "Absolutely. I've got this." Alice hesitated. For the first time, she trusted him enough to close her eyes and rest. Nicholas realized that meant much more than words. Even though she saw Nicholas trying, Alice still carried a fear inside her. She watched him play with Julia, hold the baby carefully, prepare their meals. Everything seemed too good to be true. What if it was temporary? What if? When he realized that being a father and a partner required more than a few small gestures, he simply gave up. She didn't want to believe it and get hurt again. But Nicholas was determined to prove he wasn't going anywhere. One night, Alice was sitting on the couch rocking the baby when Nicholas walked in. He watched her for a moment before sitting down next to her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. "About us," Alice replied. "Nicholas." "I'm afraid," she said, sighing. "But I've changed," he replied. "I'm still afraid," she said. "Alice. I've never been so sure of anything," Nicholas said gently, taking her hand. "In my life. I want you. Our son. Julia." Her eyes filled with tears. "What if one day you get tired of this?" Nicholas shook his head. "That won't happen." Alice took a deep breath. "I want to believe you, Nicholas." He squeezed her hand. "Then let me prove it." She didn't answer. For the first time, she didn't pull her hand away. In the days that followed, Nicholas continued showing through his actions that he was there to stay. He surprised Alice with little gestures. Helped in every way he could. Most importantly, was present. Slowly, Alice started to feel more relaxed. One night, while they were watching the baby sleep, Alice rested her head on his shoulder. Nicholas stopped for a second, then wrapped his arm around her. Alice closed her eyes. "Thank you for not giving up." Nicholas felt a lump in his throat. "I would never give up on you." She sighed. "Maybe I can try to trust you again." Nicholas closed his eyes, feeling for the first time that he was close to having a real family. He knew he would do whatever it took not to lose it. Alice had never imagined that one day. She looked at Nicholas without feeling angry. There she was, in his arms. After tearing up the divorce papers, her heart still had scars. For the first time, she felt like she could trust him again. It wasn't because he said the right words. Because he had shown, through his actions, that he was willing to change. The sun had barely risen when Alice woke up and realized Nicholas was no longer in bed. She got up slowly, her heart still light from the decision she had made. When she went downstairs, she found him in the living room. There was a picture of a room with Julia and her baby. She was holding the baby while talking with her sister. "So, are you going to teach him how to play soccer?" Julia asked excitedly. Nicholas smiled. "Of course. As soon as he can walk," he said. "And will he like superhero movies?" "Only the classics," Julia laughed. Then, she noticed Alice standing in the doorway. "Good morning," Alice said. Nicholas smiled at the scene. "Good morning," he said. Nicholas looked at her and knew everything had changed. This time, she was really there with him. Heart open. The days passed more peacefully than Alice could have imagined. She and Nicholas had found a comfortable rhythm. They weren't in a rush or under pressure. That afternoon, they were in the garden, enjoying the fresh air. The baby slept in the stroller beside them. "We finally found peace," Nicholas said, looking at Alice. She nodded, looking at their son. "Yes. It's been a long journey," Nicholas said, taking her hand and intertwining their fingers. "It was worth it." Alice looked at him, her heart racing. Yes. It was worth it. A few weeks later, Nicholas planned a surprise. He took Alice out. A special dinner. Not fancy. Just close and meaningful. At the end of the evening, as they walked along the lake on the estate, He stopped and looked into her eyes. You know I'll do anything for you. Right? Alice smiled. I know. Nicholas took a deep breath and then melted down. Alice held her breath. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple ring full of meaning. The first time we got married. It was for the wrong reasons. Alice felt tears sting her eyes. Now, I want to do it the right way. Alice will. Will you marry me? She asked. Her voice soft and playful. Tears welled up in her eyes. This time, there were no contracts. No bets. No hidden agendas. It was real. She didn't want to run from it anymore. Yes. Nicholas. I do, she replied. Her voice filled with joy. He smiled, gently slipping the ring on her finger. Then, he stood up and kissed her with all the love in his heart. Finally, they had found their true new beginning. What do you think? Did Alice make the right decision by forgiving Nicholas and marrying him again? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications for new stories. Don't forget to check out more emotional stories by clicking here on the end screen.